Thank you, Charles, for this very nice introduction. Thank you also, first and foremost, to the Iran Heritage Foundation, Dr. John Curtis, Nahid Assemi, for inviting me to address you here. I'm wearing two hats, one as a historian of medicine, and my other hat is director of the John Rollins Research Institute, and we have more than 1,000 manuscripts in Manchester that lie there uncatalogued, and we have now just completed the pilot phase, which was supported by the foundation, and we are now moving on to another phase supported by the British Institute of Persian Studies, and we really hope that this great collection of Persian manuscripts will one day be fully catalogued and be fully discoverable. But this is, of course, not my talk today. Today I'm going to address you on the Iranian or Persian contribution to the history of medicine in the medieval period. The first thing that one needs to say here is that this contribution depends very often on a transcultural transmission of knowledge. So the medical tradition as it unfolds in the lens of Iran and in the Muslim world more generally in the medieval period very much depends on a Greek system of thought which we call humoral pathology, which is the idea that there are four humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, which when in balance constitute health, and when their balance is disturbed, lead to disease. So these fundamental concepts of humoral pathology, of the four cardinal qualities of dry and moist, hot and cold, two of which are linked to each of the humors, these ideas were first developed in a text by Hippocrates, or attributed to Hippocrates, called On the Nature of Man, were then adopted by a physician called Galen of Pergamum in the 2nd century AD, and became really the standard medical theory both in the East and in the West, in the medieval Islamic world, in Europe and elsewhere, until the 16th, 17th, and maybe even until the 18th century, and are to a certain extent even with us today in traditional practice in what some people nowadays call Unani medicine, or Tip Unani, or whatever you want to name it. So you see like this diagram which illustrates that theory. And that theory is shared, and it was the result of a translation movement where various ideas, Greek ideas, were translated into Arabic and later also into Persian. You see here a manuscript which contains a text on the description and uses of animals, which contains material by Aristotle, whom you see there in conversation with Alexander the Great. This manuscript is here in London at the British Library. And also material from Ubaydillah ibn Bukhtishur. And I apologize if I pronounce some of these names in the Arab fashion. I mean, although I did Persian as an undergraduate, and although I read Persian to a certain extent, not to the same as I read Arabic, most of my training is in Arabic, and I mean no slight, so to speak, when I mispronounce, if you forgive me. But I mentioned this Ubaydillah ibn Bukhtishur, who comes from this family of Persian physicians associated with the city of Gonde Shahpur or Jundai Sabur in southwestern Iran, in Ahwaz. And this was a major center for medicine, and this family and other families were associated with the transmission of knowledge from an early age. And this shows you, so to speak, that Persian or Iranian physicians, even before the advent of Islam, were very much involved in medicine. Now, something happened as a result of the Islamic conquest, and this is that Arabic emerged as the lingua franca of science. It became the vehicular language in which medicine, philosophy, and other disciplines were conducted. Very much like English is used today by many different physicians, scientists from many different religions and many different parts of the world. They can all partake in one scientific discourse, which largely nowadays is in English. In a similar way, Arabic was really a shared heritage used by many different people from many different religions, from many different ethnic origins, including, of course, Persians and Muslims and Christians and Jews. And this shared heritage, this ability to translate text, to partake in the same scientific discourse without any reference to country or creed, is really very, very important. And the famous Arab author Al-Jahith, who lived in the second half of the 8th and the early 9th century, complained, for instance, in his book of Mises, that most physicians speak with the accents of Gonde Shapur. So in his day, he perceived that many physicians were Christians or Persians or maybe both. This physician whom he has speaking in this book makes this remark in a rather funny way. Now, in order to illustrate to what extent Arabic became a shared heritage, we just have to look to this manuscript, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is in Arabic, but it doesn't look it, if you see what I mean. I don't know whether anybody wants to venture a guess what letters are used here. They are, of course, Hebrew letters, but the manuscript starts, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Aunuka ya Rab, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, help us, O Lord. And then it has a text by Maimonides. It contains Talkhis Kitab Hilat al-Bur, an abridgment of the book of the Method of Healing by Galen. So you can see everybody kind of uses Arabic, in spite of what their background is. Now, today, I'm going to talk about two, Iranian giants in the field of the history of medicine. I mean, I had to be very selective because time is so short. And the first giant is Muhammad ibn Zakaria Al-Razi, who dies in 925, and who for me is the greatest clinician of the medieval period. I mean, an incredibly active and fertile medical mind, great clinical observation, great research which led to many new discoveries, and this is something I'm going to discuss in a second. So he and the other person about whom I'm going to talk, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who dies in 1037, are really giants when it comes to the impact that their medical thought, their philosophy had, not just on the East, but also on the West and on Europe. And we're going to see examples of this towards the end of my short talk. But both of them are part and parcel of this movement where Arabic is used as a scientific lingua franca, because Al-Razi wrote everything that is left that we have of him in Arabic. And Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote the majority of his works in Arabic. The most important exception is his Danesh Normé, which he wrote in Persian, but his medical work again is in Arabic. This said, that doesn't detract from their great importance. Now, obviously, both these physicians operate within this framework of humoral pathology that I mentioned beforehand. You know, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile being in balance, and the imbalance causing disease. And sometimes people have said, well, all these Muslim, Arab, Persian physicians did is basically transmit knowledge from the Greeks in corrupted form to the West. But nothing could be further from the truth. And I want to give you a few examples in a very rapid fire, so to speak, in order to show you that they are actually quite innovative. Now, the first example that I give, now talking about Al-Razi, is his treatise on smallpox and measles, في جدري والحسبة, in which he tries to distinguish two very similar conditions that had been conflated beforehand, and in which he engages in an exercise of differential diagnosis. So this is one area where you find innovation in this Persian tradition. Another innovation is in the area of medical epistemology. So epistemology, to know whether drugs work, to know how to test treatments, is a topic that was discussed already in the Hippocratic Corpus in the 5th century BC. Galen wrote a famous treatise on the sects for beginners and other works on that problem. But here again, and Al-Razi is very much aware of the earlier Greek heritage, but here again we find instances of innovation. The most famous examples is probably his use of a control group in an experiment. So he talks about treating phrenitis, which, by the way, is called by the Persian name Birsam, or I should say Barsom, Arabized Birsam, which is probably a form of meningitis but doesn't quite coincide with meningitis, and which really probably should be called Sarsam or Sirsam, but the two in Arabic are conflated. So Al-Razi talks about treating brain fever, and he advocates bloodletting as a therapy. It's something which the Greeks had already recommended, and he wanted to see whether it really works. So he took one group of patients and subjected them to bloodletting, and they were much better. And he took another group of patients, and he did not perform bloodletting or phlebotomy on them. And they contracted the disease, and then he concluded that bloodletting is useful in these circumstances. Now, I can feel a certain unease in the audience because few surgeons nowadays, or few physicians even, would advocate bloodletting in the case of meningitis. But this is really missing the point, because he has a new means, he has a new technique, a new epistemological tool that he adds to the toolkit in order to test drugs. And that's really the important point, and that is the innovation here, the use of a control group. We also have an instance which is quoted in his book to Al-Mansur, where Al-Razi basically tests the toxicity of mercury on an ape, and he also insists that one shouldn't just follow experience blindly, and he does this in the wake of a long discussion, and which takes him where he engages with the first Hippocratic aphorism: "The art is long, the life is short, the art is long, opportunity fleeting," and so on and so forth. He's also somebody who took extensive case notes throughout his career, and they are preserved in two different places in a book of experiences, Kitab at-Tajarib, and I have 10 more minutes, I was told. Yeah. No, sorry, we have like one of the speakers is not coming. So the book of experiences, Kitab at-Tajarib, and where he deals with experiences, and then his comprehensive book, Al-Kitab al-Hawi, where he have also case histories. And again, he says that it's important to read Hippocrates' Epidemics. Again, very interesting progress. And he shows us in these works and in other works that he engages in hospital practice, and that the hospital, the bimaristan, another Persian word, there are so many in the Arabic language of the time, that the hospital is of great importance, and we will hear more about this, I think, later on. So he is the great clinician of the medieval period. Now let's move on to our second person, Avicenna or Avicenna. So he writes the most important book in the history of medicine, probably ever, but at least in the medieval period. He writes the Canon of Medicine, the Qanun fi Tibb, which in 5 books, which deals with diseases from tip to toe, with the general physiology, and with the simple and compound drugs. He writes this massive book, and it is basically, it changes the face of medicine. It changes the way medicine is done. It is translated. We will see this in a second. It is translated into Latin. It has a great impact and is of massive importance. So no other book had such a great impact on how we do medicine, or how we did medicine, let's say, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, than this Canon of Medicine by Avicenna. And now it's divided and subdivided. It's very well organized. And sometimes scholars have said, well, did this not lead to a certain stultification, a scholastic tradition? And here one has to say, no, that's probably not the case, because first of all, there are many new and innovative things in Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, one of which is for instance, his invention of the inner senses in order to solve the mind-body problem. Another is in the area of medical epistemology. Another example that one could mention is that of how he treats, for instance, lovesickness, and I'll come to this in a second. But also the whole commentary tradition that follows. There are hundreds of commentaries written on the canon, commentaries and super commentaries and super commentaries, or one of my colleagues calls them super duper commentaries. These are written, and they contain many interesting and new ideas, such as Ibn Nafis's discovery of the pulmonary transit. Now, there is a controversy whether Avicenna was a practicing physician, and what I've argued recently is that there are many, many instances in the canon where he says jarrabtu, where he appeals to tajriba, to experience, and also in a case of love sickness, in which he palpitates the pulse of the sufferer and is thus able to find the reason for the patient's suffering. Now here you see Al-Razi again, and Al-Razi is here translated into Latin. This is a translation of the 9th book, or the 9th treatise of the book for Al-Mansur. It starts in nomine Christi, Amen, rubrica huius libri est talis, and so on and so forth. So it's all Latin. It starts in the name of Christ, but you see Al-Razi here in Latin garb. And this is just to show you that both the book for Al-Mansur, this medical encyclopedia, the comprehensive book, Avicenna's canon, all these important works written by Iranian physicians were translated into Latin and had a tremendous impact, were very, very popular. And Vesalius, for instance, wrote an abridgment of Al-Razi's book for Al-Mansur. And that's what the first thing that he did, like the great anatomist Vesalius. So it's something which is still with us in the Renaissance. And the same is also true for the canon, Avicenna's canon. So you see here a manuscript at the Royal College of Physicians in London here, which contains, I mean, this is the beginning. Avicenna gives a definition of medicine here. Medicine is the science by which one knows the state of the human body, what is healthy and what is unhealthy. This is like a quick summary of it. and you see in the top right corner there a Latin translation by a Renaissance hand, which tries to read this text, and this shows you that not only during the Middle Ages did people study these texts and translated them into Latin, but there was also great interest in these texts in the Renaissance, also here in London at the Royal College of Physicians, for instance. But perhaps the book which had the longest lasting legacy is that by our friend Al-Razi, our Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Al-Razi, on smallpox and measles. Here you see John Channing's edition of the Latin text, of the Arabic text with Latin translation, and this is nearly the first Arabic medical book published in these isles in Britain. And not only was this book of historical interest, but John Channing, an apothecary, or a member of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, whose president he was, this John Channing, this practicing apothecary, had an interest in practical medicine. And in late 18th century France, this was translated into French very quickly, and people said, if you want to treat smallpox and measles, what you should do is read Al-Razi. This man's work was still relevant nearly 1,000 years later, not just from a historical perspective, but in actual practical terms. And now I come to my conclusion. What you see, basically, is that there are many physicians in the medieval Islamic world, many physicians of Iranian heritage who contributed greatly to the development of medicine. I could only talk to you about two, Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, but there are many others. And there's a later tradition where medicine in Persian also develops, where these Arabic treatises are translated into Persian and then have a further impact. But for me, nothing shows us more than these two physicians, even if you take all the people who write in Arabic, these two exemplify more than anybody else that the medical tradition that is developed in the medieval Islamic world is really part and parcel of European medicine, of our tradition, and the knowledge that exists on the different shores of the Mediterranean. This medical knowledge and this exchange of knowledge really created one culture in which people could partake in the same scientific discourse, whether Christian or Muslim, whether Arab or Persian, or from any other background. And this is really the beauty of this tradition, and that made it so vibrant. Thank you very much indeed.